Salve or salvete, today's video is going to be about deponent verbs. Before we get into the deponent verbs themselves, I want to take a second to review our passive personal endings. Let's start with the present, imperfect, and future tenses. Starting with the present tense, the endings are rister, mini, inter. In the imperfect, it's baris, bator, ba mini, and bantor. In the future, if it is first or second conjugation, it's baris, bitter, bimor, bimini, buntor. And if it's third io, or fourth, it's eris, ater, amer, amini, and enter. These forms all make up the present passive system. Now let's review the passive personal endings for perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect. For perfect, it's the perfect passive participle plus one of the present forms of sum. So sum est, sumus estus sunt. For pluperfect, it's the perfect passive participle plus one of the imperfect forms of sum esse. So eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. For future perfect, it's the perfect passive participle plus one of the future forms of sum esse. So ero, eris, erit, erimus, eretus, erunt. Something to just make sure that you know, in the plural, make sure to change the perfect passive participle ending to agree with your subject, so it can't just remain ending with an us. It has to change to either a long I, an AE, or an A, depending on what the subject is. This makes up the perfect passive system. Now that we've had our review of the passive endings, you're asking yourself, what are deponents? How does the passive review that we just had relate to deponents? Well, here's how it relates. Deponent verbs are a special type of verb that only have passive endings. However, they are translated actively. So if you come across a deponent verb, it will have one of the endings that we just went over, like the rister, but it will be translated actively. So it'll be translated as is verbing, not is verbed or is being verbed. As a consequence, if you come across a deponent verb, it will not be able to go into the passive. It will not ever be translated as was being verbed. It will only be translated as was verbing if you came across it in the imperfect or something like that. I've just said that deponent verbs and passive verbs have the same exact endings, so now you're probably saying to yourself, well, great, my BS test, I'm going to get this question, it's going to have a passive ending, and I'm not going to know if it's a deponent verb or if it's just a regular passive verb. What should I do? And the answer is, if you don't have the verb memorized, and yeah, you're in a little bit of a bad spot. But there is a trick that you can have that can help you to distinguish between a passive verb and a deponent verb. We know that normally passive verbs do not take direct objects. However, transitive deponent verbs do take direct objects. All transitive means is that it does take a direct object. It's not intransitive, it's not in the dative, something like plaquet or liquet. Those are examples of intransitive verbs, but they are not deponent. So let's take these two sentences. Como veor his miseris liberis and magister discipulos experitur. So out of those two sentences, if you knew nothing about which verbs are deponents, which you probably don't, which one of those two sentences do you think contains the deponent? If you said the second sentence, magister discipulos experitur, then you'd be right. That's the one that that's the one that has the deponent because it has the direct object. Well, it's not deponent because there's a direct object there. It's deponent because experior is a deponent verb. So let's say that you aced that test. Great job. Woo. Now, being a good Latin student, you want to expand your Latin vocabulary. So you crack open a Latin dictionary. If you are looking at a dictionary, deponent entries into the dictionary are going to look different than just normal, regular verbs that we're used to. Let's take a look at an example of a deponent verb in a dictionary entry of a deponent verb to show you what I mean. So let's take this deponent verb, conor, conari, conasso sum, to try. The first thing that you'll immediately notice that there are only three principal parts. There's a first person singular in the present, there's a present infinitive, and a first person singular in the perfect tense. There is also no perfect passive participle, which makes sense because this cannot go into the passive. So that's the main thing that you are going to notice when you look at this in a dictionary. Now that I have a dictionary entry of a deponent in front of us, I want to make some points that I was making earlier about how deponent verbs, they might have passive endings, but they are translated actively. To start, let's take a look at the infinitive, konari. Normally, we would associate that with the present passive infinitive, and you'd think that this verb that konari would be translated as to be tried. Well, one, that doesn't really make any sense, and two, since this is a deponent verb, this is its present infinitive. In essence, this is its present active infinitive. So konari, in this instance, would be translated as to try. Now let's take a look at the third principal part, or the perfect stem. Normally, a participle plus the form of sum esse, we reserve that for the perfect passive system. However, this is how deponent verbs get their perfect active system. So conatus sum would be I tried, conatus est would be you tried, conatus est would be he, she, it, or just he rather, he tried, conatis sumus would be we tried, and so on and so forth. So now that we've gone over some of the characteristics that deponent verbs have, let's go over some more characteristics. Like normal verbs, deponent verbs exist in conjugations, and these conjugations are decided by the infinitive, with the exception of third IO, because you can't look at the infinitive alone for third IO. If the infinitive ends in long A, R, long I, RE, the deponent verb will exist in the first conjugation. According to Allen and Greeno, over half of the deponent verbs exist in the first conjugation, so you'll see this a lot. If the infinitive ends in long E, R, long I, airy, it'll exist in the second conjugation. If the infinitive ends in just a long I, it'll exist in the third or third IO conjugation. And if the deponent verb ends in long I, R, long I, eerie, it'll exist in the fourth conjugation. In order for a deponent verb to exist in third IO, it has to end in, the first principal part has to end in IOR, and the infinitive has to end in a long I. So here are some examples of verbs that exist in each conjugation, with why they're in that conjugation highlighted in brown. For konor, konari, that infinitive ends in long A, R, long I. That's what makes it in first. For warior, it's the same thing. The infinitive ends in long E, R, long I. For both sequor and morior, the infinitives both end in a long I, so they'd be in the third conjugation, but we know morior is third IO because it ends in IOR for the first principal part. For experior, we see that experiri is the infinitive for that verb, so we know that experior will exist in the fourth conjugation. Another interesting thing that deponent verbs do is that they have a perfect active participle, but they lack a perfect passive participle, because like I said, deponent verbs don't work in the passive. The perfect active participle is formed by taking the sum out of the third principal part. This is just translated into English as having verbed. So let's take our friend konor again. Konatus would be translated as having tried. Deponents, they still have gerundives, which is the future passive participle, but you don't need to worry about that until Latin 3. Now I'll go over how to translate deponent verbs. Here's a chart. Each row is a different tense, and the middle column will cover the different forms that you use, plus the translation of the deponent verb. If you're translating a verb in the present tense, you would use the rist, mer, many, inter endings, and you translate that deponent verb as is verbing. If you were in the imperfect, you would be using the bar, baris, batur, ba, mur, ba, many, bantur endings, and that would be translated as was verbing. For future, if you're in the first or second conjugation, you use bor, baris, bitter, and so on. And for third IO, and fourth, you use ar, eris, ater, and so on. That would be translated as will verb. Especially now that you can see the forms plus the translations, see how it's not like will be verb or was being verbed. These are active translations, even though that they are passive endings. And these are only for these special deponent verbs. As I hinted at earlier, if you were to translate perfect for a deponent verb, you would use a participle plus the form of sum. So the sum est, sumus estis sunt. and you would use that participle all the way through. It's the participle plus the appropriate form of sum. Like I said earlier, if you're in the plural, make sure the participle also reflects that you're in the plural. In perfect, it would just be translated as verb. So conor, it would just be tried if it was in the perfect. For pluperfect, you just use the participle plus one of the imperfect forms of sum esse, so eramasarat, eramasaratis, erant. And that would be translated as had verbed. For future perfect, you would be using a participle plus one of the future forms of sum esse, eroereserit, eremaseritis, erunt. And that will be translated as will have verbed. Now that I've gone over how to translate the deponent verbs, let us conjugate! As a quick side note, if you were to translate this sentence into Latin, you would use the hortatory subjunctive. Hortatory is derived from hortor, which is a verb meaning to encourage, and it is also a deponent verb. So here's a chart with our friend again, conor, conari, conata sum, to try. Each of the different columns is a different tense, and each of the different rows will be a different person. First, just as a reminder, conor is a first conjugation deponent verb, and we know this because of the ending of the infinitive, which is the re ending. So now let's start with the present family. If you were to conjugate conor in the present, it would be conor, conaris, conator, conamor, conamini, and conantor. And respectively, it would be translated as I try, you try, or he, she tries, we try, y'all try, and they try. If you were to translate conor into the imperfect, it would be conabar, conabaris, conabator, then conabamor, conabamini, and conabantor. And that would be translated respectively as I was trying, you were trying, he, she was trying, we were trying, y'all were trying, and they were trying. If you were to translate this into the future, it would be conabor, conabaris, conabiter, conabimmer, conabimini, and conabuntor. Notice like how when we did future with passive verbs, how the E changes, how you cannot have that short IE. It wouldn't be conabiris, which is kind of awkward to say. That I changes to an E. I'll cover this more in a second. And that would be translated respectively as I will try, you will try, he, she will try, we will try, y'all will try, they will try. Now let's conjugate conor into the perfect family. Conjugating conor into the perfect tense would be conatus sum, conatus es, conatus est, conati sumus, conati estis, conati sunt. This would be translated into English as I tried, you tried. For the third person singular, this can only be he tried, not she tried. I realized I had made this mistake after I had made this chart. I'd made this problem for all the other third singulars, so I'll hit those again when I get to those. So moving on to the first person plural, conati sumus would be we tried, then y'all tried, then they tried. Conjugating conor into the pluperfect would be conatus eram, conatus eras, conatus erat, conati eramus, conati eratis, and conati erant. Translating that into English would be I had tried, you had tried, only he had tried, not she had tried. That would be conata erat. Then conati eramus would be we had tried, then y'all had tried, then they had tried. Conor into the future perfect would be conatus ero, conatus eris, conatus erit, conati erimus, conati eritus, conati erunt. I've underlined erunt because in normal verbs in the active, we're used to seeing the future perfect for the third person plural be erint, like amawerint would be they will have loved. But since you're using a participle plus a form of sum esse, that has to be erunt. You don't have to change that to erint in this case for deponents. Translated into English, this would be I will have tried, you will have tried, only he will have tried. She will have tried would have been konata erit. Then konati erimus would be we will have tried. Then y'all will have tried, and then they will have tried. We did it! We conjugated a deponent verb. So now let's have some notes that we can take away from conjugating a deponent verb. We didn't really see it this much with a first conjugation verb. We saw it once with the second person singular imperfect form, but the short I to E rule that we learned when we learned passive still applies here. So this is more prevalent in third and third IO. So if we had the second person singular present form of morior, which is a third IO verb, that would be more eris and not more iris. It's just hard to say, it's more awkward. The Romans didn't like it, so they didn't bring it into Latin. However, this isn't, like we learned, this isn't the case in fourth conjugation, since the fourth conjugation I is long, so it's not changed. So the second person singular form of experior, which is a fourth conjugation deponent verb, would be experiris, and that's easier to say. That means, as we learned, the difference between a present and a future second person singular in the third conjugation is just a long E. So loqueris would just be you are talking, but loqueris would be you will talk. Just holding that E just a little bit longer makes the difference between the two. So now let's do some more practice. So I want you to do a synopsis for the following verb. Werior, wereri, veritasum, meaning to fear. If you don't know what a synopsis is, all I want you to do is give the one form for each of the 6 tenses for the person and number that I provide. In this case, it's the third plural, so only give me the present, the one present, imperfect, future perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect form that matches the third person plural. I'll give you a second to do that. So here are the answers. So for the present, it's werenter. For the imperfect, it's weribuntur. For the future, it's weribuntur. For the perfect, it's weriti sunt. For the pluperfect, it's weriti erant. And for the future perfect, it's weriti erunt. This translated would be they fear, then they were fearing, then they will fear, then they feared, then they had feared, then they will have feared. So do another synopsis, this time for the Latin deponent verb, sequor, sequi, sequitus sum, meaning to follow. For this one, do a synopsis of the second person singular. I'll give you a second, pause the video, try and piece this one out. So this one is where you're going to have the short I to E rule take place. So the present form for this one would be sequeris, the imperfect would be sequebaris, the future would be sequeris, so it has that long E as opposed to a short E in the present form. The perfect would be sequitus s, the pluperfect would be sequitus eras, and the future perfect would be sequitus eris. This translated would be you follow, then you were following, then you will follow, then you followed, you had followed, and you will have followed. Since we've had some practice giving the different deponent forms and translating them, why don't we take a second and let's do some practice sentences. The deponent verbs have been highlighted and the relevant principal parts have been given. So take a second, pause the video, translate the sentences on your own. Now that we've had a second to translate them, let's start with the first sentence. Hostes gladio gladiatoris mortui sunt. Here, our deponent verb is mortui sunt. It's in the perfect tense, so this would be translated into English as died. So, this entire sentence translated into English would be, the enemies died by the sword of the gladiator. In the second sentence, the robbers will overtake the slave, who was a very slow man. Here, the deponent verb is will overtake, and it's in the future tense. Since consequor, which means to overtake, is a third conjugation deponent verb, we would be using our r, aorist, ater endings to talk about the future tense. So this into Latin would be praedones servum consequenter qui vir lentissimus erat. Our final sentence, Leones whereamer quod nos necare volunt. Here our deponent verb is whereamer. Here, whereamer is in the present tense because it's a second conjugation verb. So this would just be translated as fear. So this entire sentence into English would be, we fear the lions because they want to kill us. If you had an issue with the sentence thinking that leones might be the subject and not the direct object, make sure that you are looking at the endings of your verb, that they agree with the subject. Since leones would be third person plural and we have a first person plural ending on the verb, leones cannot be the subject of that part of the sentence. Same thing with the back half of the sentence. Volunt, that's a third person plural, so it'd have to be they, not nos, which would be first person plural. If it was first person, if nos was the subject, the verb would have to be volimus. The last thing that I will cover in this video is how to form imperatives for deponent verbs. This is the same as how we formed passive imperatives with regular verbs earlier in the year. For singular imperatives, you want to use the present active infinitive. Here we actually do want to use the traditional active endings, the ra, are, and so on. All you would do for the deponent verbs is just use the correct form for the correct conjugation. So for example, since conor is already a first conjugation deponent verb, we would just tack on the first conjugation ending that we are used to seeing, which is the ra. So for conor, the singular imperative would be conare. If it was a third conjugation verb, something like loquor, then it would be loquere. That would be the singular imperative. It's all dependent on what conjugation it is. It just takes the normal ending that we're used to for the infinitive. And then in the plural, there's nothing weird, there's nothing tricky. It's exactly how we learned earlier. You just use the second person plural present form. So the form that ends in mini. So for conor, the plural imperative would be cona mini. Since I want to give you a little bit more practice with participles and imperatives, let's try these two final sentences. The principal parts for the deponent verbs that you'll encounter are given in the bottom in blue. So take a second on your own, try and translate them. Alright, let's try and translate these sentences. The teacher struck the student having talked in the school. This would be rendered into Latin as magister discipulum percussit luctum in ludo. So here the participle is luctum. It has to agree in gender, number, and case, which is masculine, singular, and accusative with discipulum, which is why you get the um ending. It's translated as having verbed, which is why we have having talked, because loquor means to talk. For the second sentence, stay, boys, in the bedroom, for the slaves are still preparing dinner. That would be translated into Latin as mora mini pueri in cubiculum, nam servi canam ad hoc parant. If we remember, we form the plural imperative by just using the second person plural ending, which is the mini. Since moror is a first conjugation deponent verb, we just have to have the a mini ending to the moror, so mora mini would be the imperative here. If this was only stay boy and it was a singular, it would be morare, because as I said earlier, it's a first conjugation deponent verb, so we have to tack on that ra ending for the deponent imperative. And it would just be puer as opposed to pueri. In closing, there's a special class of verbs that have only passive endings but are translated actively. These are called deponent verbs. Deponent verbs take direct objects, which are different from normal passive verbs that don't. Deponent verbs only have three principal parts. They lack a perfect passive participle because they don't work in the passive. That perfect passive participle is replaced with a perfect active participle, which is translated as having verbed. This can be formed by dropping the sum out of these third principal parts. Deponent verbs also follow the same passive rules that we had with verbs earlier in the year, like the short I to E rule, and you form the imperatives the exact same way that we did with passive imperatives earlier in the year. This is my video on deponent verbs. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.